Good morning, everybody. It is good to see you this morning. For any visitors we might have, we are glad you have joined us today. It's been asked of me a few times, so I figured I might as well address it. I wore the Tennessee bow tie last week. I couldn't wear it 2 weeks in a row. But I know that, just know that I am going to be working on a sermon series of reconciliation for when Tennessee inevitably steals the championship away from Ohio State. I know you guys will appreciate that a little bit more.
So you're saying it's way in the future?
Oh, just January. Yeah, it's coming up. Well, it's good to see everybody. I hope you've all had a blessed week and a good weekend. When you're taking your American history classes growing up, you inevitably hear about all the different bad guys in history along with the good guys, don't you? You have your Lee Harvey Oswalds, you have your Aaron Burrs, you have your John Wilkes Booth. The bad guys always seem to get the middle names included, right? But one of the first bad guys you inevitably learn about in your American history classes is this guy. Now, you probably don't know who he is, but he's fancy. That's because he was paid off well. This is Benedict Arnold, okay? What was Benedict Arnold notorious for? He was a traitor. One of the first, one of the most famous. He was one of the people to betray his country in its earliest days. And you know, that story, it sticks with us. You can just use the name Benedict Arnold for anybody you feel like stabbed you in the back, and everyone understands that reference. He didn't assassinate anyone. He wasn't the leader of an opposing army during a war, but he was a traitor. He was a traitor, and now he's etched in our minds through history and through the generations. There's something deep within us that can't tolerate someone who betrays their family, their friends, or their people. You may know, you may be reminded of Dante's famous work, The Divine Comedy, where he kind of fictitiously goes through the various levels of hell. And as he's touring through the levels of hell, every level has worse punishments for people who committed worse crimes and worse sins throughout their lifetime. You remember this from 8th grade English, right? You know what? A lot of times we might not remember it, or maybe we just don't know it, but it's interesting to point out that in the 9th and final layer of hell, Dante prescribes that layer for the people who betrayed their communities and their families and their friends. He found mutineers, traitors, backstabbers to be the worst of the worst in the world and sat them at the deepest level in hell, even further than murderers and so many other things that we oftentimes consider maybe being worse today. And then right there, at the very center of hell, right next to Satan, Dante wrote, "There sat the most famous traitor of all, Judas Iscariot," right? So this is the second week of our monster series, kind of coinciding with the monsters you see decorating lawns over the last couple of weeks, coinciding with the monsters being told about on TV series and the spooky atmosphere going around. But we're doing our own survey on some of the monster-like figures in the Bible. And last week we looked at the Gerasian demoniac from Mark chapter 5, or you might better remember him as Legion, right? This man who is living wild and out of control with a legion of demons within him, living in the middle of the cemeteries. And you can see how that story fits really well in a series on biblical monsters, right? I mean, that's a scary image. So it might seem like talking about Judas is a bit of a step down on the monster scale. But is it? You know, is it? Like I mentioned, we don't stomach traitors very well. There's something about someone who's willing to sell their own people out that repels us a bit. And for someone to hand over their friend, let alone the Savior of the world, to an awful death, you know, that's someone who is just deeply twisted on the inside, and I think fits that definition of a monster, if you ask me. And, you know, so this morning I'd like to read a couple of the passages, in case it's been a while that you read them, in the Gospels that tell us about Judas's infamous role in the last days of Jesus' life. And we'll start off here in Matthew 26. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. And then we jump into John chapter 13, and John writes, after he said this, Jesus was troubled. Isn't that interesting? He was troubled in his spirit and testified, very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. His disciples, they stared at one another at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, hey, ask him which one he means. Leaning back and against Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? I love that they also didn't know. It kind of just tells you who Judas was and the life he was living amongst them, that they weren't even sure which one of them it could possibly be. Because generally as people, we have a guess, don't we? We have this intuition, but they had no idea. So Jesus answered, it is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. So Jesus told him, what you're about to do it quickly. And then back again to Matthew, when they're in the garden after that meal that they had just had. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man, arrested. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Jesus replied, do what you came for, friend. Man, how cold do you have to be to betray someone with a kiss? To plant your lips on someone as a way of sending them to their torture and to their death. You can just see this snake-like maneuvering from Judas throughout these stories leading up to the death of Jesus. You know, it wasn't a heat-of-the-moment thing. It wasn't a spontaneous action that he did out of emotions. No, this was premeditated. It wasn't even, as some have tried to say, an accident where Judas was trying to get Jesus and the religious leaders to have a nice sit-down conversation and talk about their differences. No, this was cold-blooded betrayal. And I think that this bothers us so much because we can't see how someone who spent so much time with Jesus, who spent so much time with God in the flesh, how they could choose such evil. Especially how they could choose such evil against Jesus himself. How does someone kill the light of the world after having been so closely warmed by it? Right? How does someone kill the light of the world after having been so closely warmed by it for so long? It breaks our rules a little bit, doesn't it? It breaks our preconceived notion, our rules. We assume and we believe and we preach that people are changed by Jesus, don't we? People are changed by Jesus, and yet Judas was not. If anything, he grew more evil. It's not supposed to work that way. And so we start making excuses for Judas. I see this all the time in scholarship, in other sermons, and other ministers, just in other Christians. We start making excuses for Judas. I already mentioned how some will say that he thought he was just trying to get them together to talk, which simply just doesn't fit with what the story is telling us. The other idea is that Judas was faking it all along. That he was never actually one of Jesus' disciples. He was just faking it from the beginning. But I don't think that fits either. It doesn't. We're told that Jesus, he sent out the 12 disciples to minister. Do you remember this? Luke chapter 9. He sends out the 12 to minister, to heal, to cast out demons, to teach, to preach. And we have no reason to believe that Judas wasn't one of those. That he wasn't a part of that very successful and effective ministry. Look, many of the disciples, many of those 12, had their own troubled souls when Jesus called them, okay? We learn about Simon the Zealot. We learn about the tax collector. We know that they had their own troubled souls when Jesus called them. And so I'm sure Judas had his own pre-existing issues, but we have no reason to think that he wasn't excited and he wasn't sincere when he decided to follow Jesus' call into ministry and into the way of the Lord. He jumped in willing and ready to be a part of God's kingdom. Another excuse that's often used is that the devil made him do it, right? We read that, we just read in John chapter 13 how Satan entered him. When he left to go get the enemies of Jesus, Satan entered him. But I distinctly remember being a kid, having done something I wasn't supposed to do, that I just felt awful about, and asked my mom when we were driving somewhere if the devil can make you do things. You know what she told me? All the way back then, I was in Houston, so I was less than 10. No. And that answer is still true today. We trust that the devil cannot make us do anything. Now, you won't see me denying any legitimacy of spiritual warfare. It's something that's legit. It's something that we should be careful about. But the devil does not control you. He does not have that option. He does not have that power. Judas made the deal to betray Jesus before that even happened, didn't he? He went to the chief priest and was ready to betray Jesus before that scene in John chapter 13. And really, this excuse that the devil made him do it, it gets it completely backwards. He didn't do it because Satan was in him. His willingness to choose evil is what opened the door for Satan to have a bigger role in his life and in his actions moving forward, okay? It's backwards. Lastly, and similarly, since it was predicted to happen, some will say that he had no choice. It was his predetermined destiny. But I just can't deny the God-given gift of free will that easily, personally. God doesn't predetermine us for these kinds of evils. Now, God knew it was going to happen, and that starts causing some questions. But God doesn't work in time the same way that we do, right? I don't think we can even start to begin to describe the way that God relates to time. We should have no problem believing that God can know the results of the future while still giving us the freedom to genuinely choose our own path, right? So these excuses, they don't work. They don't work out. Judas had been sincere in following Jesus. He wasn't controlled by the devil. He knew what he was doing, and he did it on his own free will. So maybe we have to face the fact that proximity to Jesus doesn't always equal righteousness or salvation. Do you hear that? Maybe we have to face the fact that proximity to Jesus doesn't always equal righteousness or salvation. Now look, I preach, and I believe that the more exposure we have to Jesus, the better our life will become. I preach that. I believe it. I'll believe it till the day I die. Okay, that's for Christians. That's for non-believers. That's to grow spiritually. That's for knowing truth. I believe that the more time we spend with Jesus, the better we will be. Amen. But, hear that but the human heart is a powerful and sometimes scary thing, isn't it? It is a powerful and scary thing. The human heart, hear this, the human heart can sit before the brightest of lights and still choose to focus on the darkness of its own shadow. All right? It can sit before the brightest of lights and still choose to dwell in the shadows, the darkness of its own shadow. Judas spent 3 whole years living by the God in the flesh, living by the creator of the universe, living by the life and the King of Kings and love. 3 years of watching miracles, 3 years of listening to Jesus teach the deepest and greatest truths of all life. And in the middle of that proximity and that presence and that exposure, his heart resisted and rebelled against it. Because that was his choice. He had that option. He had that power in himself to rebel against it. And I think for some, realizing that, understanding that can be a sigh of relief. I know many parents who, when they realize that truth, it's a sigh of relief for them to think that a lot of times they've spent their life wondering what they did wrong, that their kid has chosen to live in such pain and such a harmful lifestyle away from the light of the world. This right here is a great reason that is to understand that it's not your fault. Maybe it's not your fault. Maybe it's just the rebellious power of the human heart. Judas spent 3 years completely exposed to Jesus himself and wound up doing things like this. This is John chapter 12 and verses 2 through 6. John writes, "Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume, and she poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, John puts in there, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a whole year's wages. Now, he did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to whatever was put into it. This is a man who spent years listening to Jesus in the flesh every single day, and yet chose to live a lifestyle like this. By the way, this is the straw that broke the camel's back. If you look at your gospel stories, this is the incident. And when this is over, he goes to the chief priest ready to betray Jesus. This is the last straw. How do you sit there day after day in the presence of Jesus, hearing the words of life, and you wind up a person who just literally steals from the poor in a very direct way? Jesus regularly said in his teachings that for those who have ears, let them hear, right? We see this over and over again. Those who have ears, let them hear. Those who have eyes to see, let them see. Clearly, Judas's ears had been clogged and his eyes had become cloudy. And there might have been a lot of things lending to that obstruction, but one of the things that is completely reoccurring in the Bible as a hindrance to Judas, whenever we see him choosing something evil and something wrong, there's something very specific that's always involved with that. And what is it? Money. That's right. Money. When we see Judas making these evils, it's surrounding his love for money. He allowed his greed to cut him off from Jesus. He allowed his greed to cut him off from Jesus and ultimately lure him into betraying the true Son of God. But here's the thing. That's not all that unique to Judas, is it? That's not all that unique to Judas. I've been pretty hard on old Judas this morning. I think that's fair game, okay? But what I want us to see is that his condition, his monstrous acts, are not actually all that foreign to our own shortcomings, are they? Right? We view Judas as a monster. It's maybe one of the biggest monsters to kill God or send God himself to the cross to die, to choose death over the giver of life. And yet, his actions are not all that foreign from our own shortcomings. I've seen plenty of 21st century Christians have their own eyes and their own ears blocked off from the message of Jesus because of money. And you probably have as well. And money is just one of those vices, okay? I've seen people turn their back on Jesus for money, for sex, for power, for pride, for comfort, and so much more. Now, these people, they didn't walk side by side with Jesus in the same physical way that Judas did, but they had still walked with Jesus. They had still heard in his words. They had still listened to his teachings. They had still seen his great power in their life, like so many of us have, right? And yet they let these little things of the world cloud their heart. And here's the thing, is once that happens, all Satan has to do is find the right price to get us to completely abandon and betray our Savior. Once we've been cut off, once our eyes, our ears have been blocked off from the message of Jesus, all it takes is finding the right price. It's one thing to become blind or deaf to Jesus while still following him. Like, obviously, that is not good. But Satan knows that such a distraction can easily be repented from. If you are still following Jesus, you might be blind for a moment, you might be deaf for a moment, but he knows that can be easily repented from. So he'd rather take you all the way to abandonment, all the way to betrayal. He's just got to find the right price. Now for Judas, it was a measly 30 pieces of silver. That's all it took for this friend, this true friend of Jesus, to hand him over, to have the light of the world be brutally murdered. So let me ask you, what's your 30 pieces of silver? What's the price that you would betray Jesus for? Now, of course, we think, well, surely there's no price that could be offered that we would trade away our Savior. But it's a bit shocking to realize that we turn our back on Jesus for cheap sums all the time, don't we? We settle for the price of fitting in. When God is mocked in the workplace and we sit quiet because we don't want to make a scene, we settle for the price of fitting in. We settle for the price of pleasure when late-night computer screens are chosen over our call to godliness. We settle for the price of convenience when we decide that the often gatherings of the church and God's people throughout the week is just too much time and too much of a sacrifice. It's shocking to realize that we constantly give Jesus up for Satan's cheap offers. And we each have our own 30 pieces of silver. Now as people, as the church, as people who know Jesus, who knows that he offers full and abundant life, we regularly regret when we've made these mistakes, don't we? We feel the burden of sin, and we feel the burden and the weight of brokenness that comes with leaving Jesus for lesser things. We just feel it in our very beings, don't we, when we realize we've made such a mistake? It usually doesn't take us very long to realize that nothing is worth handing Jesus over, that if we could go back, we wouldn't do it again. And that was true for Judas as well. We read a lot of 26. This is Matthew 27 in the opening verses. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse. What a great illustration. He was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and he hanged himself. I don't know who translated that. He went out and hung himself. We see that Judas, he's struck to the heart about his sin, like so many of us often are when we realize we've made that bad deal. But in this passage, I think we see probably the second biggest mistake Judas makes, okay? When he realizes his sin and the magnitude of that sin, he decides he has no hope. And what does he do? He ends it. But what Judas failed to realize was that Jesus was up there on that cross, not just because of him, but also for him, right? Not just because of Judas's actions, but for Judas's actions. Jesus was on that cross to save him too, to save that great betrayer. Even the horrible betrayal that put Jesus on the cross would be washed away by the blood of Jesus on that cross. And that's good news. That is gospel message. That is good news, because it wasn't just Judas's betrayal that put Jesus on the cross, was it? It was also my rebellions. It was also my betrayals. It was also my sin that put Jesus on the cross, that put Jesus to death. And it was your betrayals as well. We all have had a hand in Jesus' tragic death. But he chose to take our evil actions head on so that we might be redeemed. And what's beautiful is that the one who was betrayed, he becomes the one who would forgive the betrayer, right? The only one powerful enough to truly forgive the betrayer. We no longer must be known by our moments of evil, for we have been made children of God. We can see ourselves in Judas. We probably do see ourselves in Judas. But I pray that each of us would take the opportunity that Judas missed, okay? That when we realize the weight of the sin in our own lives, that we don't just go out and end it, or we don't just consign ourselves to defeat, but that we would accept the free gift of grace offered to us through baptism. And if you're here this morning and you're ready to make that commitment, ready to make that decision for yourself, that you recognize that you no longer want to be the traitor, the greedy, or whatever vice you think might identify you, you can be washed free of that to become a child of God. You need only to come forward now as we stand and as we sing.